So yeah, I mean, I would genuinely be intrigued here to see what happens. I mean, I think it's a bold play. It's a bold play saying you're still going to at some point go for Moscow. But I do genuinely expect what we're going to see here is everything going around. But yeah, as has been pointed out in chat, don't worry if the first kind of day for this takes some time to process, because obviously the game in the background has got to run an awful lot of kind of automated scripts to sort everything out and set everything up. Um, the other thing that's worth kind of mentioning, someone mentioned in chat about the the manpower levels that we're looking at on Germany here. So if you look in here, he's got a manpower reserve of 4.5 million.
Mm.
The Soviet Union is running at about 4.4. I suspect, and obviously these figures are kind of they're gamed slightly to fit in with the game, but Hearthstone prides itself on being very serious. But it's worth us having just a quick look at what people's policies are. So we talk, and I suspect this will come up when we start hitting further in. But if we look at manpower laws here, we can see that the Soviet Union are currently running with limited conscription. So they're only running limited conscription. This is giving them 2.5% of their recruitable population. Um, but we should also then look and compare to Germany and see how that fits with actually what Germany's doing, even though they've technically got more men on paper. How are they getting that? And actually, if we look at that, we can see that you can tell from the name their conscription law is very different. It's scraping the barrel, and that's going to have an effect, isn't it, Dan, on kind of the industry and everything else that they can do.
Yeah, there's a massive knock-on effect to quite literally scraping the barrel, and I think they've used exactly the right term there. You can see this during the Second World War. As the war progresses, what you have is the upper conscription limit goes up and the lower conscription limit comes down. Those people have got to come from somewhere. In many cases, they're coming from industry or they're coming from kind of occupations that are seen as secondary to those people in the military. They're also typically not going to be your prime soldiers. We're not talking about necessarily 25 to 35-year-olds or 20 to 30-year-olds who are going to form the mainstay of an efficient and active army. Higher up you go and the lower down you come, generally speaking, the quality is going to be impacted.
So
So
we're
yeah,
seeing
it
here.
plays a big difference.
So we had a brief unpause there. I noticed. I think we paused again, just so that the game can sort stuff out. Um, but I think we can see already here. There we go. We're slowly off again, and you'll notice time's passing in the top corner. For those who haven't spotted or aren't familiar with the game, you can see the game passing here. We're playing on speed 1 at the moment, which isn't surprising. This is a lot for Mordred to deal with here. Um, it's the war is escalating. You can see already some of these rail signs picking up as people move away. Um, yeah, and actually we've got a pop up there the Yugen taking part in the army. I mean, as someone's pointed out in chat, their grandfather was drafted away from his family farm, barely 20 years old. It was an immense impact in Germany. Exactly. They're taking people away from these vital jobs, and that has an enormous impact on the ability to produce. Now, actually, it's an incredible achievement the Germans managed to do what they do, and I think a lot of that's down to Albert Speer, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, I mean Spear, for all of his negative sides, and there are a considerable number of them. Personally, think he was very fortunate to escape the hangman's noose in the post-war Nuremberg trials. Was actually something of an organisational genius, and what he was able to do in terms of consolidating nationally the war effort, and managed to actually have input increasing in the latter months of the war, really quite staggering. Albeit we should of course not forget that these weren't increasing without the risk to the population, and of course, those things are made in many cases by forced slave labour at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. So Albert Speer is a really controversial character. It must be said was something of a genius when it came to maintaining industrial output.
It's something that's you might find that we pepper into this, as obviously Dan and I are both avid readers as much as anything else. Um, there's a book by I think Gitta Sereni, which is Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth. It's well worth a read. It's a really interesting insight into Speer and his mind and the type of person he was. As Dan says, I think one of the things that helps Germany hang out so long is they do have a few kind of key people in key positions who are very smart and very clever, and whether out of devotion to their country or through their belief in Nazism, they do contribute greatly to this. we should probably just pause now. As the game's unpaused, you can see fighting's now underway. So I've just focused us briefly on Romania down here, so we can see Romania. Just again to explain to people who aren't necessarily what's sort of au fait with the symbology here. We're playing as Germany at the moment, and whatever country we've got picked, whenever you see these symbols, this is how well a battle is going. So if we see a 44 here over this, that's basically out of 100. 0 is a loss, 100 is a win, is the way to think of it. These units are kind of facing off. The fact that this symbol is green means that at the moment at least, our troops, in this case the German troops, are having the advantage. Yellow means that it's starting to go against us, and red would mean that we're starting to lose. So the red one over here in 10 is showing that actually here the Soviet forces are pushing very effectively here against the German forces. Again, I do suspect that Romania is going to be a key fighting ground here. As Dan said earlier, it's such a massive oil reserve that it's going to have an enormous effect. My suspicion, as we talked about earlier, is that we'll see a lot of this land conceded almost, as there's a big rush to kind of do something over here. But obviously, you can't attack here yet. We've got that weak ban rule in place. Dan, do you want to give us a bit of a talk through the situation in Italy, because that's quite interesting at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, Italy historically, at least as far as things go, is a really interesting but very very hard fought piece of ground, and I guess a lot of people who know of the Italian campaign during the Second World War will be aware of perhaps someone like Winston Churchill's famous phrase, which refers to Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe, and his suggestion is that an attack made through Italy is going to be able to open a second front, which of course it does way before the Normandy campaign, and to give the Germans more to deal with, more real estate to deal with, and put a pressure on one of Germany's major allies. All of those things are achieved by opening a second front with very well constructed landing in Operation Husky, and then later on a far less well constructed one in the Anzio landings, and also the advance up the boot of Italy. The reality of the fighting on that ground, though, is really dictated by the geography, and you can see it from the map we're looking at. It shows that really clear spine, the Apennine Mountains running up through the boot of Italy, just crisscrossed, generally speaking, left to right by rivers. This is, in a way, a defender's paradise. It takes relatively few German troops, albeit it should be said very high quality German troops, to actually the cork in that bottle and keep a much superior force, both numerically and in terms of equipment and quality, bay.
So chat tells us that Mordred is currently setting up his navy. He forgot to set up his navy, which, I mean, to be fair, I think is something that could maybe be an accusation that could be levelled at Hitler himself in about 1939, couldn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a fair argument that the Germans certainly forgot their surface fleet to a certain extent. We know of the couple of really famous German battleships. You've got the pocket battleship, the Graf Spee, which is taken out of the running very, very quickly. Got the very famous sortie out into the Atlantic of the German battleship, the most powerful in the world at that time, the Bismarck, which was short-lived thanks largely to the Royal Navy's main battle fleet. And then you've got where we're looking up in the north there, which kept its entire time in a fjord.
See, interestingly, I mean, there's a hell of a lot of railway symbols on this. I suspect someone might have decided that Norway is not really that worth saving. Which, I mean, as you know, someone who has experienced the beer prices in Norway, I'm inclined occasionally to agree with some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is a very big question, really, isn't there? Norway is not a massive agricultural output, so it doesn't have a huge positive impact for Germany. It's tying down a lot of troops. So yeah, there's a big question from the German point of view. One of the real gems is actually this neutral country that we can see next to it in Sweden. Sweden is one of the few countries that is willing to and can literally trade with Germany during the Second World War. And Sweden is in effect the farm output for Germany, particularly when things get going tough. A really key player that's quite often overlooked.
I mean, a lot of that is the ability to provide sort of natural resources as well. I think one of the things that really gets overlooked is in a lot of kind of general accounts of the war is what it does with in terms of supply of critical materials, and that can be everything from industrial diamonds to tungsten to steel. There's actually some enormous deals that are sort of done on the sly down in Portugal, between Portugal and Germany to kind of maintain neutrality. But yeah, vital materials, as you say, for Germany are coming from Sweden, which is enormously critical to them.
And it's an interesting point. Actually, it comes back to the navy to a certain extent, and I've used this analogy with regards to the First World War before, but actually it sits quite well for the second. And if you were to take the world as a monopoly board, and you were to take Britain, for example, which controls the world's seas almost exclusively, if you like, have a hotel on every country in the world, with the exception of Sweden, and Germany have a house on Sweden, and they can land on that one, have one safe passage, but eventually they're going to land on something which is controlled by Britain. Really, it's almost a starvation process.
There's actually one I will write it up one day and share it on Twitter. But in the National Archives, there's some absolutely wonderful documentation about the industrial diamond supply, which is critical to the manufacture of tanks, of weaponry, and everything else. And actually, the Germans have an incredibly effective smuggling operation going on in essentially in British Africa, where they're really actually getting the majority of their industrial diamond supply for a while out of British territory, right under the noses of the British, because it's one of the few places they can get it from. It's one of the reasons they try and rush both Antwerp and Amsterdam at the beginning of the war, is because they're both massive centres of industrial diamond manufacture. Let's head back over here so we can have a look now. See again what's happening. While more armies are going on. Interestingly, we've still got this pocket here going on here. Now, there's 7 Soviet divisions here. It looks like Mordred's pushing pretty hard on essentially dealing with them. Now, what we can see here is a certain amount of tactics in play. Do you want to talk through kind of what this essentially is and why this is a useful tactic then?
Yeah, I mean, this idea of pockets, or as the Germans would refer to them, Kessel or cauldron, is actually something that we see really quite regularly on the Eastern Front in particular in the Second World War. And it happens in 2 waves, if you like. The first being the German advance during Operation Barbarossa. The big chunks, big whole Soviet armies are overrun and encircled and eventually forced to surrender. We're talking somewhere in the region of more than 2 million men in the first year of the war, which effectively destroys the Soviets' chance to hold any lasting defence. And exactly the same thing happens a couple of years later when the Germans come flooding back through this area, partly as a result of great Soviet skill in the offence, and partly as a result of rather stupid decisions made by a certain Adolf Hitler, who decides that certain cities to be held as fortress cities, despite the fact there is, of course, limited life to anything like that, and quite simply they're going to be starved of everything.
And this is a key thing that, as you say, it kicks in on the Eastern Front is, and depending on how this goes, you might see it later on as we head towards sort of areas such as Königsberg. But is this the sort of the stubborn refusal sometimes of Hitler to allow his generals to retreat, to allow them to withdraw and then come back, is enormously costly to Germany in terms of forces.
Yeah, and it's a tricky one to think about, actually, because quite often, particularly looking at something like this, we're trying to look at these decisions with logical eyes. Of course, when you're looking through the eyes of Adolf Hitler, from his point of view, you're not looking through logical eyes, and far from it. And in many cases, German generals were looking at these choices, saying, "What are you doing? You know, we're at risk of losing 50 or 100,000 men on a regular basis, holding something which is indefensible or which has got no strategic importance at all." As far as Hitler decided, it was something that needed to be held for whatever reason he felt was most appropriate.
So here's an interesting thing that seems to be going on. Certainly the Allied AI has decided that France is a very dangerous place to be indeed, and it does seem to essentially be trying to withdraw. Which, I mean, again, this is an interesting thing. You know, we can talk about how this can be all history and everything else, but actually it's quite interesting in itself, because it really highlights, just to a certain extent, how much of a gamble on a human terms actually invading France was.
Absolutely, and you know, actually, it's an important point, because what we should really bring this back to is the fact that we're doing this for VE Day, and of course we are talking about those people who risked everything all that time ago to take part in effect what we're looking at. It's the risks that went into the Normandy landing were absolutely huge. If you can imagine landing upwards of 100,000 men on D-Day alone, and hoping everything would go well, or that enough things would go well that your main force wasn't chucked back into the sea, goes to show you that even someone as experienced and in the know as Eisenhower himself written 2 letters which were potentially to be issued post D-Day, one explaining that the landings had been a success, and the second explaining they had been a complete failure and withdrawal was the only other option. And thankfully he decided eventually the one that he was going to be issuing to the world was the one saying that the D-Day landings were indeed a success.
Now, interestingly, what we're seeing here as well is, this would be Eisenhower's worst nightmare. As we can see from here, the Allies have actually already lost the port, and by losing those port accesses, which we discussed, are so critical at this stage, they're in real trouble here already. Because actually, again, they've been pocketed there. They're still holding territory here, but it could be, and even if Mordred takes this back, I mean, that doesn't mean game over in any way, shape or form. But it would be an enormous kind of advantage at the start to him, because it would allow him to suddenly start focusing somewhere separately. It would allow him to maybe shift some of those critical divisions that he's got sort of eastwards to try and deal with the ever expanding kind of Soviet snowball that's kicking in on this side. But yeah, this really highlights just how much of a gamble that the Normandy landings in their own way were.
Yeah, in a big way, and it wasn't lost on anybody either. I'm very fortunate, and I get to spend time with a lot of veterans of the Second World War, and whilst a lot of those D-Day veterans that I do have time speaking to didn't necessarily react to the fear that they felt, but they did feel at that time like they were going into a really epic moment of history. And a lot of those guys said, look, we're going to do a job, we were there to do it and do it to the best of our abilities, and that was all there was to it. On an individual level, really, that was as simple as it was. Do your job, do what you've been trained to do, and hope that everybody else does theirs. Fortunately, in the early phase of the D-Day campaign, enough of that was done right in that foothold was established.
And I think what we're seeing here is, again, it's by no means over, but I mean, Mordred is now into the point where he is allowed to attack down there. So I do suspect that he's not stupid. He'll be dealing with that in a way that perhaps actually the German generals themselves in reality would have liked to deal with it, but were to a certain extent held back by that need to keep things in reserve.
Yeah, there's an element of that, and I suppose one of the real key things that we can see is this stuff floating around in the skies above Normandy at the moment. Because the reality is that the Allies' spirit is not the word. I mean, complete supremacy or dominance was just extraordinary around that time, to the extent that anything like a German armoured division that even looks like it's going to be approaching the Normandy beachheads, or even Calvados region in general, could literally be hammered into oblivion by Allied air power.
So in reality, we've just passed the 17th of July, and in reality there was something actually that happened on the 17th that was also a bit of a blow to Germany at the time, wasn't there? That was the kind of the wounding of Rommel in a strafing attack.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a perfect example if you think about it. Well, in fact, it is really a perfect example, because if you can imagine, memory, it was something like a tempest, which was possibly a typhoon from the RAF, which was looking around the area and was trying to hit enemy targets. And it gives you an idea of just how superior the RAF were, in that one of these aircraft, which had flown from the United Kingdom all the way across, armed with ammunition, with its pilot, with all his training experience, was looking for the most appropriate, most important and most significant target he could find, which, well, one would have been a tank or a fuel reserve or a train or an ammunition column. He had enough of the lack of targets. He decided to expend his ammunition on a single staff car going down a road. Actually, without knowing it, he really hit the bullseye, and he managed to wound Rommel. I think he ends up losing losing an eye, if I remember correctly, or certainly he was badly wounded at the time and ended up leaving Normandy shortly after.
So we also have something here as well. I mean, these things are coming thick and fast that Mordred's having to deal with now, which is of course the plot on Hitler failing. That is, again, it's a key thing, and it's as much a reaction in part to events in the east as it is in the west. But this again was another blow for the Germans at a time when they could ill afford to start having to kind of worry about getting rid of generals, working out who needs doing, purging troops, and everything else.
Yeah, in a big way as well. In fact, it does end up ending Rommel's life in that he's implicated in this and ends up committing suicide as a result of his failed assassination attempt, which is undertaken by, of course, famous Count Stauffenberg in the Wolfschanze in East Prussia. And it really plays out in an attempted coup d'etat actually in Berlin itself.
So we're seeing here that if we focus around, we should probably have a bit of a pan around and see what's going on here right now. So let's have a look. So I think we can see, remember we've got Germany selected here. Mordred is very much gambling on the Allies not invading Norway. As we can see up here, Norway has no troops in it now. If the Allies were to land there, if the AI was to land there, they would be unopposed. Meanwhile, down in Italy, we can see that there's some various naval engagements going on. I think we might have it. Yeah, we do. We're just arriving in time to see it. The British are attempting to land around Genoa. They have secured 2 separate beachheads in Italy. This is something that perhaps Mordred wasn't necessarily expecting. Could be problematic if he doesn't spot it quick enough and pull his Italian troops back to kind of deal with it. And this is something to remember. And we're looking here. It does seem very likely at this point that the Allies are going to lose their Normandy landings, and that is an important thing, but it's not going to stop them attempting to land elsewhere. And this is Mordred's problem, as it was Germany's at the time, is none of this is ever clear where people are going to land. Things need to be secured, and every front is vital for them now.
It's certainly not signposted, and in the time period leading up to Normandy, it was known as Fortress Europe, and that means that all of the edges are just as vulnerable. In fact, that in the map you're looking at right now, we're just about within vision of the area that's used for Operation Dragoon, which is the secondary landing in southern France, which eventually draws away more troops from the defending Normandy beachheads. In fact, would probably be quite a good idea for our troops fighting up in Normandy at the moment if a second front was to open in France itself.
I think one of the things that's interesting with this, and obviously we're doing this stream specially for VE Day, but it's something that we've talked about for a while, both ourselves and with Mordred and others. And one thing I would find very interesting to do is to do this with actually a human player playing as say the US or as the Soviet Union as well, because one of the things that Mordred will have a slight advantage on to a certain extent is he's a human being, and he can try and be a bit more creative than say the computer can be. You would be interested to see if a human player, if they spotted that they really weren't going to achieve up here, would, as you say, maybe switch their effort back to the Mediterranean, and maybe kind of Churchill's thing about it being a soft underbelly would actually in some way prove to be more accurate.
Yeah, it's. I mean, of course, we're slightly straying counterfactually, but actually, it's a really useful exercise as far as this is concerned. And what we've seen just a couple of minutes ago is a really key example, because that landing in the northwestern part of Italy there, can just by looking at the map realise what a headache that could have been for the Germans. If they managed to stretch across to the east coast of Italy, all of a sudden, cut off a really sizable chunk of German defenders in a pocket. And it looks like that might be what we're seeing in some sense.
It's certainly what the Allies are trying here. I mean, we can see here. I mean, we can see the numbers of divisions. But remember, we're looking at this from Mordred's perspective, so we can see exactly how many divisions he has allocated to this. He's got 20 divisions turned around to try and push this back, and we can see that actually up here he's allocated 10 to do the same. That's a real problem for him, because that's 30 divisions he's now had to commit down there to dealing with that, and he's still got to maintain the pressure down here with another 21. So everything he's gaining up here, I'd be very surprised if we don't see some units start to move back.
It's a good point, and that's just to say that there are a finite number of troops in the German army at any given time during the Second World War. As the war progresses, that number goes down. So I think as time elapses here, you're going to see that problem really multiply, and that he's going to have more fires to put out, and less troops in which to put those fires out with.
Let's not forget with this either that the Soviets haven't gone away; they're getting closer, and that's the thing you never want to hear with regards to Soviet armies.
Absolutely. I mean, it's that classic Soviet juggernaut, really, isn't it? They're just an incredible fighting force, and the quantity that they could put into the field, quantity of men, quantity of manpower, and even quantity of good quality tanks, for example, is a really key thing. Not necessarily the most refined in the world, but they're rough, ready, and they're very, very effective.
And that's something that's important to remember again is, what the Soviets lack necessarily in tech. I mean, the Germans really do emphasize quality. There's an awful lot of frankly rubbish that's talked about Tiger tanks and them being actually unreliable, and the thing is they're actually incredibly reliable. They're very good tanks, they're very well made, but they're designed for a very clear purpose, and that purpose is attack. Once you have to start using them to defend, to retreat, defend, they're not really being more used for what they're designed for. Whereas the Soviets at this point, they've got pretty much, they're running generic material. They've got their Shermans, they've got everything else. And if you've got enough of them, as Dan said earlier, quantity is a quality all of its own.
And it's interesting that you've drawn the comparison there. And yeah, absolutely, the Tiger is a Tiger, but I suppose the reality of the Tiger is it's a bit of a slow, fat one, to be honest with you, because once it's got such limited maneuverability, in a fast-flowing battle, actually, they become fairly vulnerable. And as you pointed out with the tanks earlier, there's a great comparison that you can draw between, for example, the Mark IV tank and one of the early T-34 Russian tanks. These things are effectively comparable, but actually the T-34 made to a ratio of at least 8-1 compared to the Panzer Mark IV is just really raw, really basic, but equally efficient. And
I feel like we should pan around and watch for the AI here and see if it's doing anything else sneaky. I do wonder whether this Norway decision is going to come back to bite him. If the AI launches an attack up there at the moment, he has an enormous problems. There is nothing here really to hold anything around. And like you say, he's got a fly swap. He has to massively fly swap what's going on here and really work hard to do things. It looks like we're recovering down here. Although it seems that Turkey has decided they're no longer talking to Germany, which is a bit of an issue.
Well, I mean, Italy is looks like the Allies have agreed with Churchill's philosophy here, and Italy is a soft underbelly, and the reality is it wasn't. It's the name that is sometimes associated and was partially put forward in the 1940s regarding the Italian campaign, is that those guys were D-Day dodgers. They were sunning themselves in Italy, as the song tells us. The reality is the Italian campaign was one of the most vicious and bitter of the entire Second World War. Just looking at the famous assault on Monte Cassino itself, on multiple battles for that one mountaintop strongpoint, tells you all you need to know about the Italian campaign. It was certainly no holiday.
And what we're seeing here as well is something we talked about earlier in Finland. We can see that from the messaging that Finland has agreed to an armistice. Today, Finland has signed an armistice with the Soviet Union and United Kingdom, officially ending the continuation war with the treaty restoring the Moscow Peace Treaty of 1940, with several modifications. Now, the good news for Mordred to a certain extent is, due to his relative successes at the moment down on the coast, this is probably actually less of a problem for him than it would have been otherwise. But it's actually a bit of a forgotten and actually a bit of a sad note is just that the Finns were always in this battle for survival, and they allied with the Germans as much because they were the people who would help them as much as anything else. And that did lead them at this stage of the war to almost end up having to fight people they'd been fighting alongside for a long time.